Good morning, good afternoon, or good evening, and welcome to today's SecurityBoulevard.com Roundtable, brought to you by Techstrong. My name is Cody J. Brown. I'm the host of Techstrong Learning, and we have an exciting panel for you ahead. First, I do need to cover just a couple of housekeeping notes. Today's session is being recorded, so if you miss any of our discussion, maybe you'd like to rewatch later or share with a friend. The on-demand recording will be made available shortly after we conclude our live session today. If you have any questions, and we really hope you do, because this is a conversational program, we want you to send those in to us using the Q&A tab on the right side of the screen. Over on the right side of the screen, you'll find a few more options, the first of which being the chat tab. We want you to reserve that for more general discussion. Maybe let us know from where you're tuning in or what role you play in your organization. And we've also got the handouts tab. So if you click on that handouts section, you'll see there are quite a few downloads for you there. So feel free to grab those at your convenience. And of course, before we close out, we are giving away 4 $25 Amazon gift cards. So be sure to stick around for the duration of our program today. So for today's conversation, we'll be discussing application security. And I'm joined by Frank Fisher, Senior Product Marketing Manager at Sneak, Jeffrey Martin, VP of Product Management at Mend, Max Vetter, VP of Content at Immersive Labs, and Dan Shagru, Senior Product Marketing Manager at Digital.ai, formerly Arxan. Leading our conversation today is a familiar face to Techstrong Learning. Welcome back, Sharon Florentine, Managing Editor here at Techstrong Group. So Frank, Jeff, Max, Dan, and Sharon, thank you all so much for joining us. Sharon, you want to take it away?
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you so much, Cody. It's great to be here today with all of you and all of you in the audience too. Thanks so much for those of you checking in from all around the world. Greetings from beautiful, cold Philadelphia here. So application security, this is obviously one of the most important topics in the entire security and cybersecurity field. So I'm just going to jump right in and hopefully we can make this really interactive. Again, audience, if you've got any questions, pop those into the Q&A and we will try and draw them into the discussion as we go along. So obviously application security comes down to the fact that vulnerabilities are still making their way into applications. Why is this still happening and what can we do about it? Dan, you want to kick us off? I know that's a
Sure.
really big, broad
Yeah,
thing to start with,
that,
but
that's a big one. Yeah, that's a wide topic. So, I mean, I think they're still making their way into applications because, for one thing, we never we haven't or hadn't solved the application security issue, when it was, or well, 4 or 5 years ago, before we saw this explosion in the number of apps. So we have sort of an insecure foundation on which we are building more apps. So more companies are putting out more apps more frequently than ever before. Some of our customers, and numbering in the hundreds, some even over 1,000, which is a little bit mind-boggling for me. And these aren't even necessarily tech companies. So it's we didn't really quite figure out how to do it when we only had a few coming out of every company, and as a result, we now have more insecure apps that are coming out.
And as someone just posted, actually, API-based threats too. I mean, we didn't even have a handle on this when we were all building monoliths, and now, there's microservices and APIs exploded like 600 something percent over, year to year, I believe. So yeah, that definitely doesn't help the situation.
That's a good point. I mean, over the last few years, how we've built apps has begun to change too, right? Rise of cloud native, microservices, but applications are effectively just conglomerations of massive amounts of reused interfaces and components put together into a new way with a little bit of custom code thrown in. And because of that, it's not just that, we're still getting vulnerabilities in our applications. It's also that increased interdependence makes the vulnerabilities a little bit more important.
Right. We saw that, almost exactly a year ago, right, with Log4j, that, oh my God, it's everywhere. And I think that brings up another important point, because a lot of the components, Jeff, that you were talking about are open source. And so, some people will say open source, is that part of the solution? Is that part of the problem? We have a little bit of I thought we had a little bit of a debate going on about this, but is that the wrong question to ask?
Yes, I would say so. I think that if you look in the statistics and stuff like this, open source is not much better and not much worse than ISV provided software in this regard. I think the key problem in open source is, and this is a benefit and it's the drawback that it has, is this kind of a not being organized idea. Everybody can. There's this bazaar model of open source. Everybody can set up a booth, can have an idea, can put up a library there, and hopefully people will start to gather around it, community will build up, and stuff like this. So this is the benefit of it. It brings a lot of innovation, it brings a lot of agility, no question. The downside of it is that we don't have an authority. We don't have somebody that is kind of responsible for these things, or that can be held responsible in a way. We have a community of people, maintainers, that might change, that might even go away totally. And there was an attack recently on some of these open source packages where the maintainers simply disappeared. Somebody took over the domain, redid the email addresses of these domainers or maintainers, implemented the email accordingly, implemented the access to these packages again, and started to publish malicious versions of these packages. And this is obviously something that open source doesn't have this authority, the definition of authority in this regard. And I think this is something on the one side the industry is now thinking about. So Google, for example, started to have marketplaces with reviewed libraries in there, and now Google is kind of taking over this kind of responsibility in a way. On the other side, I think anybody using open source elements need to be aware of this fact and need to have tools in place and mechanisms in place to kind of remedy the problems that you get into by having open source in this regard. Yep.
Yeah, I would add that the open source originally, everyone said, well, they're going to be totally secure because everyone can check the code, right? And then when you actually look at it, and I think Bash had something like 4 people ever working on it, and and then you find out, oh no, people have jobs. They're too busy to go and check someone else's code for them, which is where Google stepped in well. But I think that was for ages an assumption about open source that has clearly been misproven as well.
Yeah. I mean,
I would. Sorry. Yeah.
I was going to say that I think the big issue with open source versus commercial products, right, is that people assume the risk is on the open source community to resolve. The responsibility for security, they assume the community will take care of it. But the actual responsibility lies with the user of open source. They have to make sure that they are using it in a secure manner, that they're using secure code. Whereas with commercial, all that responsibility just lies as part of the contract. It's what you buy. So you're basically entering into a risk transfer to an unknown entity that you then don't pay any attention to.
I did, yeah. I saw something on, I think it was on Twitter, where a legal letter had gone from someone affected. It might have been Log4j, but to some open source developer, and just said, "You must fix this."
Yeah.
And the guy was like, "I've got another job. Like, this isn't my problem. This is
your problem." Like,
yeah.
Exactly. Yeah, so I mean, I would agree. So open source can be secure, it can be insecure, and it's definitely a mistake to assume it's secure, right? To Jeff's and Max's point. At the same time, it's not just software to help build apps that's in the open source community. There's security software in the open source community, right? So there's people, dedicated volunteers, again, who are working on ways to obfuscate code. It's one of many examples in order to make applications harder to understand, or even the OWASP community itself, which we probably all put some stock in. I mean, those are all volunteers, and they're doing good work, right? That hopefully private corporations are paying attention to and using as a standard to make sure their apps adhere to.
Yeah. And actually, I think we're going to dive a little deeper into this later, but one of our audience members asked if there are any governance standards other than OWASP that companies should adhere to when they're thinking about AppSec.
Yeah, I mean, I happen to think that OWASP is among the best of the standards. It's obviously far from perfect, and it's always, I think they understand that, of course, as well. They're in the process of improving the recent mobile application security verification standard, which is a mouthful with MassVS. I believe that should be out in the next month or so. So personally, I think it's about as good as we have right now. But of course, NIST is important. MITRE ATT&CK, et cetera.
But those are good frameworks and ways to understand risk and things like that. And some of them have decent standards like OWASP. But I think fundamentally, anybody who's really trying to focus on governance standards might be missing the bigger picture. I mean, unless you're in a regulated industry and you have to worry about, I don't know, MISRA or AutoSAR or something like that. Yes. Fundamentally, good security, it's not that many rules, right? Keep your stuff up to date. Make sure you know what your risks are. Prioritize those risks. Any good framework is better than none. And I think any framework will actually get most of those basics correct.
I think the OWASP is obviously great and exceptional, but if you look at I think since 2003, 7 of the top 10 are still the same. So it's not OWASP's fault, but there's something wrong with the whole industry if we're like, oh yeah, this is a great standard to abide by, and we just don't worry about changing or making it better.
As an industry, we all abide by the standard of I'd like to go make money at the least amount of spent.
This is true. Yeah.
It's true. Yeah.
But I mean, how much of that, and this came up before with the response, who's holding the hot potato, right? It's if there's 1 or 2 or 4 maintainers, they can't possibly keep up. But then you have these large enterprises who are basically like, oh, goody, it's free, I'm going to use it, but then I'm not going to maintain it. So I don't know that there's an answer to this particular question, but is it really anyone's fault or everyone's fault that those OWASP are always the same if we keep throwing the potato back and forth? I don't know.
I think there's a very clear answer if you look into legal space.
Okay.
If I am as a company, I'm using open source to provide a service, to provide an application, whatever. I'm taking over this responsibility. I am now the person or the entity who publishes something. And with this regard, now I'm in the forefront of everything. And there's nobody behind me that I can sort of say point on and say, no, it was not me, it was them actually. So I think in this regard, it's a very, very clear-cut answer that, when it is your service, when it is your product, you are taking over the responsibilities in this. And if you happen to read, the licenses in this regard, they are also very clear in this, so that there is nothing that nobody should be surprised about this in the end,
Is that, do we think do companies do that though? All the libraries would we say that every legal team and every company is making sure every library is kind of secure, and that how do we go anywhere from that?
And this is the point, it's not about absolutism in this regard. It's about due diligence and due care. So if if you get breached as a company, we all understand that these things could happen. Even if you invest the best of it, it still can happen. But then, you need to absolutely show that you did whatever was asked from you, whatever was necessary, according to the current technologies and stuff like this, you had your tools in place, you had your processes in place, and you did your homework in this regard. If it then happens, it's still not good, but it is at least something that is, how should I say, you did the utmost to kind of prevent it in this regard, you know. And I think this is a point where a lot of companies are currently taking it sometimes a bit too easy in this perspective. You know, they are not aware that there can be severe punishment. And I mean, I'm living in the European Union, you know, we have the GDPR. If you're looking in the clauses regarding GDPR and the punishment that is in there, this really hurts, you know. And the European Union said we will not enforce it in the beginning, but sooner or later, you know, we will get more and more and more into it. And now we are in the more and more phase, you know. So as a company, you need to be aware that this won't be a joke anymore, you know. It will be hard.
Yeah, we throw around the word supply chain a lot in our industry, right? And I don't know, I'm a product guy. I actually, way back, I was in medical devices, actual physical supply chains. And I think that's sort of the helpful analogy here. If I was building a pacemaker, I knew where every screw came from. And if that screw had to get recalled, it got a recall notice. And, you know, I could do whatever I had to do. Recall the pacemaker. I don't know what you do. But you can't do that with software. It's like the entirety, your bill of materials, is constantly changing. Its risks constantly change. And the responsibility as the shipper of the application is yours. But trying to keep track of all that is a nightmare. It's just too fungible. Too changeable, rather. It just keeps moving. And the only thing you can really do is put in place automated tools to detect vulnerabilities, detect known things, give you remediation advice, and then listen to it. So, I mean, I don't know about you guys, but I see plenty of people putting in tooling and then they kind of check that box and then just don't listen to it. And if you're not listening to it, why bother?
Exactly.
Yeah, I would agree with most of what you said. I mean, we need to check for known vulns. I'm not sure I agree that it's an impossible task. A medical device is a good example. I mean, there's a lot of pieces in a cardio device, but look at, if you're making an airplane, you have to track all the parts. You have to figure out where they're coming from. That's a very complex task, and it's not impossible. It may be, impossible to get to 100% certainty, but there are plenty of safeguards in place that prevent crashes. Don't always work, obviously.
I will 100% agree with you, but I do know, just from my med device days, we spent a lot more money on that than anybody does in application development.
Well, sure. So there's
it's impossible at current investment rates, I'll say.
So I think we could probably all agree on that. We as an industry, we should be investing more in security. But the other point I was going to make was, beyond testing your supply chain or ensuring that you know where your code is coming from, you can do things to protect the code in the app itself, right? That's beyond just finding known vulnerabilities or eradicating known vulnerabilities, right? I mean, you can take steps, as I was mentioning before, obfuscate the code. You can take steps to make sure that you're monitoring the code or the app rather once it's outside in the wild. And then you can add stuff that will provide things like runtime application self-protection. The app shuts down if it's tampered with, for example. So there's more that we can do. And I would agree that more should be spent to do that.
But the point you made, Jeffrey, was a really good one. Listen to these tools, because as you might know, we are producing tools like this, but what we see is very often there is this notion of generating reports. Generating a report and then showing a lot of bar graphs and pie charts and colorful, and everybody has this kind of a ugly, crazy feeling that we are vulnerable, but then nothing happens, and then a month later another report is done and it's more awful than the one before, but again nothing happens. So the point that also my company is kind of pushing very hard is to say security is only improved if somebody touches the code. So we need to kind of organize and focus these tools around the developer, the person that in the end changes the code and applies the security updates and stuff like this. And this is something that, in my perspective, it's enormously important to do that. And I see a lot in the security realm, especially. I see a lot of people more in this kind of auditing idea, more this kind of let's summarize, let's report, let's be aware of what we have there than to be the other way, to let's be actionable about these things. Let's try to
I think that comes down to proof, doesn't it? Because a CISO has to prove that the money they spend, any executive have to prove that the money they spend are going to a good place, right? You'd hope most companies do that, but so they have to prove that what they're doing is a value, right? And that's where all the compliance and all the reports come in. But actually, how do you actually prove that if you plug it in and if you turn it on and you get the report that you're actually actioning that? And I think that's where the human element comes in, right? There's process, people, and technology, and the people side. You can have amazing tech, but if you don't have the processes set up and then the people aren't looking, like, oh yeah, we've just got 1,000 alerts, but it's great. That's the element there, that if the people don't know what to look for and they're not really, whether it's a security team or whether it's a testing team or whether it's a dev team, they have to be joined up, really, all them as well, to know what they're looking at and then fix it.
And so with DevOps and DevSecOps, that's another element of how applications are built today. And, one of the tenets is it goes faster, and it goes faster and faster and faster. And so is that accelerated development speed, is that part of the problem too? Because it's moving so quickly that, like, sure, you might have someone there who can look at it and touch the code, but is it too fast for them to do anything about it? And I think when we talked about this before, I know Frank had a great response to this, so I'm going to ask him to go first.
Okay. Yeah, in my perspective, this accelerated speed of development, it's probably the wrong question to ask if this is, so to say, contributing to the problem here. In a way, it is. But I was looking up actually the lines of code that we had for the Apollo landing computer, and it was roughly, I saw the number, like 600,000 lines of code. And I compared this with a Linux kernel, so which has 15 million lines of code, depends what you have there. Don't split hairs on this one. But today's Linux is literally in every router you have in your home, in every smart plug that you have there. There is some parts of Linux in there, and it probably has much more than 600,000 lines of code. The point that I want to make with this is we are now used to have so much better, faster, more convenient, smarter systems. Will we now stop doing this and go back to a slower process and simply to increase security in this, simply to increase security? And I would say no, it will not happen. And this is the point what I want to make in saying, if you're asking this question, there will be no answer that say yes or no in this regard. The question must be, looking at the way we are developing software today, from the monoliths, client servers, now we are talking about microservices and whatever will be the next coming around here. I think we have to accept that these architectural changes are happening and that these processes are set up in the way they are set up to support even more software in our environment, even more intelligent system and stuff like this. And we have to ask the question, how can we set up the processes, the tools, but also the human side of it, so the people developing the stuff, the people involved in that process, to bring in security, to support the security sense in developing this. Otherwise it's maybe an academic question to ask, but it won't help us in reality to bring security, to bring more security.
I think.
Sorry, go on, Dan.
Oh, thank you. I think that's fair to say. I mean, it may be that we're developing quicker, and there's more lines of code, and there are more apps and more microservices, et cetera. But that's coming back to Jeffrey's funny point. We're obeying the laws of capitalism essentially here, right? We're building things because people want them, and we're building them more quickly because people want them more quickly. So slowing down is not really an option, right? The question becomes, I think part of the solution can come from our educational systems. In the US anyway, we've got 50, if you look at the top 50 computer science programs in the country, right, as measured by US News and World Report, only one of them has a security requirement in it. So we could be training developers better, to even be aware of security challenges. And then, the question is, in the real world, right, one governed by the world we live in, capitalism, should companies be made to make up that gap? We're getting our best engineers from the top 50 CS programs. Should we then have, a know before, some sort of training that is going to somehow make these developers smarter? Yes, we should. But in the meantime, we're going to be putting out thousands of apps or millions of lines of code. And we need to figure out ways to protect those apps without necessarily interrupting developers while we get them up to speed.
One interesting part that you, sorry.
Go on, Frank.
One interesting part that you just mentioned is DevSecOps. And I think that is also one of the things we mentioned, capitalism quite often here. One of the premises or the promises that DevOps did was, by having this agile process, you will be faster in delivering software to the customer. You will see how a customer is interacting. You can use this agile process to slowly but steadily iterate yourself towards the real solution for the customers and stuff like this. What we often see is that the more or less classical way of introducing security into this is by introducing a kind of a watershed moment. There's like a red button somewhere in the process where the security team can literally stop everything that happens here and send it back via tickets to the development team to fix it before it goes in the production side. And this is actually, when you think about it, it forces this kind of agile process into a waterfall. What you're doing is you're breaking it and you are, stopping the whole velocity it had. Everything is going. So if you're thinking in how can I, so to say, get these benefits from DevOps, having this agile process and stuff like this, you need to think about DevSecOps, because otherwise you break the process, you will make a waterfall out of it. And DevSecOps in a way means that you integrate security into every step in your DevOps process. And by having this spoonful of security from the beginning, everywhere in there, you don't have this kind of a agglomeration, this accumulation of problems where somebody needs to press the red button then and stops it. And with this is the kind of the promise of DevSecOps to be able to have this agile process, but have increased a better security in the whole system process.
Yeah, I'd say that's the thing. Moving left with, and that's what DevSecOps is all about. But in terms of people's skills, that it keeps evolving, right? If you're, I think for any developer and particularly anyone in security, knowing a tool or knowing how to do a certain thing is not that useful, because in 5 years it will be different and change. So it's really the malleability of kind of learning as well from a personal point of view, if we're talking about people, and moving left as much as possible. Because do you want to wait until the pen testers, like Frank said, that just turns it into waterfall. If you wait for the pen testers to test it and it has to go all the way back through, really you want your devs. We're working with some companies who their pen testers and devs are very similar. They're the same people from the same background, and they're really kind of pen testing as they go, because they understand so much about vulnerabilities. But that's usually more advanced. Particularly financial services seem to be more advanced on that because it's more to lose, right? And again, it's down to the capitalism bit. It's more to save as well.
Yeah. It's interesting that as we're discussing this, there's two comments came in that sort of, I think, reflect the two things we've been talking about. One is, participant 243 saying that, we should include security from initiation of implementation and design thinking, which we would all love to have happen, I think, right? And then participant 811, for a few teams, technical debt is so much that looking at security aspect becomes overhead, which is kind of, I think, sort of similar to what Frank was saying, or correct me if I'm wrong, Frank, but it's like, if you do that, if you force or ask developers to think about security, in some ways you may be breaking the agile process. Or if you're going back to them and saying like, hey, this is broken, fix it. It's a little bit waterfall-ish to think about that. And so sometimes I wonder if we're putting too much emphasis on shift left all the way to developers and maybe not enough on shift left just into ops, right? Like typically security is at the end of the ops, right? End of production. If you think about like traditional InfoSec groups, the firewall, or et cetera, but it doesn't have to be. Like you could add security into an application during the release process or just after build, before release. And that's a possibility. That's something that I think can and should aspire to do. And we do, at the company that I'm coming from. But, I think it's not just the developers that need to learn, right? It's the operations people can learn.
So I think it's not just ops. So fundamentally, if you think about the actual basis of your security, there's two big things. Your design, how it's designed, right? You either design it with mitigations in mind and in a secure way, or you don't. And you have technical debt. Old things are less secure.
Yep.
And fundamentally, we don't actually empower developers to fix either of those. We empower them to update a library, perhaps, and make sure they're not introducing functional risk. But we don't ask our developers to re-architect. We don't ask them to maintain technical debt at a certain level in most companies, because that's not how the business works. We want that application to last as long as it can. We have this like fib about the software development life cycle. We don't have a life cycle. That would require killing something, having it die. We keep it alive forever. We have zombie products, right? And you can't be secure on a zombie product no matter how much you enable the developer. You are going to be behind that gun. And I think that's where the big changes have to come. Not just shift left and developer enablement, but shifting the responsibility to the actual company, the ones that control the resources, people like me, right? VPs of product and whatnot, and having them understand and be educated that fundamentally huge amounts of technical debt means insecure application. Fundamentally, if you don't design with security in mind, you're gonna never be able to keep up. And that means you're gonna have to actually retire applications. You have to kill them. You have to redo them. Yes, that application's been out there for 7 years and it's making you money still, but that doesn't mean you don't have to burn it down and rebuild. If security is important to you. And here's the thing, it's like quality was 10, 15 years ago, privacy was 5 years ago, data security. Consumers, and I don't mean, Joe Schmo buying your average, Google Home device, but I mean people who actually consume the applications you make. They're beginning to demand security in the same way that they demand a certain level of quality and a certain level of privacy.
Yeah.
And because of that, companies have to change their behavior, not just developers.
Yeah. When the market shifts, the company's behavior will change, right?
100%. You follow the money.
Yeah. And we are seeing that, right? We've seen, headlines about trouble at Alexa, for example, some of which could be attributed to people having maybe second thoughts about having Amazon listen to everything that happens in their home.
SolarWinds, how much did that cost them? Right? So
I think the point that we can make here is that it is a kind of a dynamic process. You cannot say you are done with this because software systems have entropy. And you need to invest energy to fight the entropy of these systems, and it's a constant thing. It's something that will not stop, will never end in this regard. You constantly need to invest some time and money, efforts to kind of keep the systems up to date, and maybe even go so far in shooting some of the old ones and replacing them with better new ones. Which also gives you the opportunity to integrate new architectural thinking, new services and stuff like this. But yeah.
But I mean, it's almost hilarious because I've had certainly a lot of people ask me, how secure is our application? It's like, well, how old is it? That's the first question I have, right? Okay, you have a 15-year-old application. Have you redone it at any point? Okay, it's insecure. Now it's a question of how much.
Yeah.
And on the chat we have coding standards. Yes, sure, absolutely. I think coding standards are necessary, not only from a security perspective, but also from a kind of a readability, understandability, stuff like this. Coding standards are helpful in so many regards. So I think we all agree on the coding standards.
Is anybody anywhere just not agree on that. I don't think so. I think everybody's on board.
I think a lot of devs don't.
Yeah,
fair.
that's true. That's fair. Yeah.
But look,
That-
that's actually an important point, like sort of a humorous one, but
Yeah.
we talked so much about shifting left and putting it on individuals. And look, the fact of the matter is individual developers' goals and incentives are not aligned with the company in most cases. And if the company wants secure code, they have to, it's on them to put in place the standards, enforce the standards, and actually care and invest. And sometimes I certainly hear this a lot from companies I talk to. They're like, well, that's the developer's problem. They need to write secure code. And it's like, no, you need to define what secure code is for you. You need to make the trade-off decisions, and then you need to enforce the behavior. And if you're not doing those three things, you are never going to be secure. You're just at the whim of individuals making individual decisions based on their own incentives.
Yeah, most developers want to write code that works.
Yeah.
And and it maybe is efficient, but adding the security thing is a whole different element, really. If coders haven't even thought about it before, why would they if they're not told to?
And if they're not
right.
incentivized to, and it's not enforced, they won't do it, because that's how humans work. They act in their own interests. Unless their interests are made to be something different, they're gonna, behave how they want to behave.
Yeah.
It's also hard for developers in a way, because as you just said, Max, they are cognitively thinking on how do I make it work. They're not thinking on how do I misuse it to make it no longer work in a way. It's like it's a different frame set they need to have to kind of think along the lines of an attacker and stuff like this. So
it goes back. It goes back to Dan's point, doesn't it? If they're not in university or wherever they learn to code, if they're not taught secure coding from that point, then why would they be thinking? You get your mindset of this is how I code. Then you've got to bolt on this thing that takes ages and is expensive and is inefficient, and why would they? It's hard.
I mean, Dan's point was great. I went through those programs, right? Like, fundamentally, what they teach you is how to write code that works.
Yeah.
I mean, even performance is usually layered on towards the end, right? I mean, changing a little bit, but quality is barely in there. Never mind security.
One thing we observe is so we are offering things like capture the flag. Okay, so capture the flag events, where we literally try a bit gamification, in trying to, you are the hacker now, and this is a system, and try to hack it and stuff like this. And one of the feedback that we constantly get is when you're asking the developers, so what kind of tools do we need now, to attack this system? And they are coming, with a nuclear option of kind of, you need to Wireshark and la la la. And in the end, you're saying, no, you get an editor and you get a browser, and there you go. And this is very, so to say, common that we get this feedback in. Like, I was really impressed how easy it is in the end, that we get from the developers that say, wow, I've never was aware that it's so easy to attack things, and to literally force the systems to behave differently and stuff like this. And it helps. Yeah,
we found that we create labs that are about just secure coding, and actually we have others that are about web app hacking. And actually, the coders were the ones asking, "Oh, can we have all these other?" Because they like learning the exploit, and they like learning that side of it. It's not all of them, but a good proportion that understands.
Exactly. And I think this is also something we can. I think not all developers are the same, but most developers like to write good code. They like to learn. They would like to have good quality work and stuff like this. So it's not like you have to totally force them in these things. If you give them the chance, and also the capabilities of doing these things, which is time. Sometimes it's a bit, having the amount of time to really think things through, and stuff like this. Yeah. But if you give them this opportunity, they will climb on it.
I'll dust off my business courses for a second with all the old fun stuff about role definition, right? If you're going to give somebody the responsibility, you've got to give them the authority, and you've got to give them the resources they need. And if you're giving them the responsibility and you don't give them the resources and you don't give them the authority to make decisions, then they aren't going to be able to do it. And you're basically just setting people up to fail.
Yeah, and that's the problem generally in training, right? Is they go, well, either you can leave for a week or something, and you get out of the office, and you have some fun or whatever, and then you come back and you kind of forget half of it, or you do continuous. But if you're not given the time or the resource, it's all time, and time is money, and so the companies have to invest in that. Like, no, you will 2 hours a week or whatever, you can go and learn, how to be a secure coder, because why would they otherwise, unless they're given that as part of their job.
And I
But I think, sorry.
Oh no, go ahead, because I'm going to
Yeah.
try and shift to a different question. So let's finish this
Yeah.
out first, though. Go ahead.
I was just thinking, in the end, everybody in the audience out there, and we had the questions of what about, what if, I have now an old project, it has technical debt. How can I, in reality, how can I go about it? How can I make it happen? I mean, it's easy for us here to say, hey, you need to give your developers the time and the resources to do these things, but in reality, what are your experiences to get such a process really rolling, and to not overburden a company? You cannot say, okay, for the next 5 years we will not publish any kind of software until we are fine and ready with it.
Yeah, it's a good one. I wanted to shift a little bit toward talking about, we've talked about developers needing time and resources and energy and space and all of that. Where does that engagement come into this? I mean, if you have a developer who maybe they want to do the right thing, but they don't have any or all of those elements, then it just becomes, why am I even trying? And then it becomes, I'm just going through the motions to get that direct deposit. And then where does burnout come in, right? Because at least it seems to me like there's been a lot of that. I mean, as far back as I can remember. So how does that impact security? And, how do we turn that around? I know we've talked a lot about the responsibility to give developers what they need to succeed, but yeah, I don't know. There were like 12 questions in there. I'm sorry.
I think it's similar to what a company has to spend money, and money can come in lots of different forms. You can spend your money on your tech, you can spend your money on the people, you can spend your money on whatever. But in that, if you're trying to get the developers into a better position from security, like we were just saying, you have to give them time, and that equals money. So they just got to have to put their hands in their pocket if they want their coders to be coding more securely, and that's the issue. And it's all profit and loss, isn't it? That's the thing. They won't until there's a big enough push that the risk is high enough, or the likelihood or the damage done is big enough, and we are seeing that shift.
But I do think, just to kind of go off what Frank was asking there are things that even just development managers, for example, can do to introduce more security in a reasonable way that doesn't cost a ton of extra time and money, which is actually the same thing. There are things you can do that say, let's not try to boil the ocean. You know what? Let's just make sure we're not, increasing the number of vulnerabilities we have. Forget trying to reduce them for a minute. Let's just make sure we're not introducing new ones. There's reasonable steps you can take that'll help. Like, our audience can go and do that now, right? Like, okay, you know what? We don't scan and we don't figure out if there's, when I go introduce a new library, if there's any known vulnerabilities. Let's start there. Let's just not introduce anything that's got a known vulnerability. Kind of a first do no harm approach. There are steps like that can be taken. But yeah, I mean, Max, you're right. The real solution is to continually advocate to people, frankly, like me, who control the budgets and have all the say about what we go build and which direction we're going to go build in, and say, hey, people care about security. You're not giving me enough time. You're not giving me enough resources to actually give you a secure application. You're only giving me enough time to give you a functional application. If you don't care about that person who controls the budget, you probably should. And here's some examples as to why.
Yeah, there's a number of great comments in the chat here about, management sees security as a black hole, and it's difficult to get that budget to invest in the solution. You only get their attention once there is a compromise. Terrifying. Yeah, and another one, it's difficult to sell security to management, but I think especially well, I think it's still going on, but the Great Resignation really should have woken people up, right? If they're not getting those resources, people are going to walk and they're going to go somewhere else, and then
I think we see it on multiple fronts. We see it on the one side within the workforce, where literally developers call it the Great Resignation or something like this. I think we see that some of them are stumping up with a foot now, and they are making a point and saying, this is how it should be and stuff like this. On the other side, we see security incidents, and there's this famous IBM report. I think they're doing it every year on how much does an incident cost you, the cost of a data breach or something like this. And you see the numbers constantly rising, so yeah, this is there. You see the legislation waking up in this regard, and you see more and more legislation coming up that is literally asking companies to react accordingly. I was in Microsoft in the year 2003, and we got an email from Bill Gates back in the days, and I remember vividly that one of the points that actually Steve Ballmer was doing was when he was asked about Microsoft and security, and that we have such a bad stand and stuff like this, that he said there will be the time, and we are working on it, there will be the time that people will buy Microsoft because of security. And I think Microsoft invested a lot, and they turned around a lot of the impression that the market had about Microsoft back in the days. I was confronted a lot with this sentence of Microsoft, you secure your platform and the rest is okay then. These days, I think it is different now. I won't say that Microsoft is perfect or something like this, but it shows that with a hard effort, and they did a hard effort, they pushed a lot of this around, and they showed themselves. They're showing themselves now different in the market. And I think this is another thing that we see coming in. That consumers are asking for this now. Consumers are getting aware of these things. And
so I love
yeah.
the historical perspective there. I'll throw two more in, because there's only really two ways these types of things get fixed: government regulation. Way back, food manufacturers weren't safe, and people kept complaining about it, and then somebody made the FDA. Great. Suddenly, all the food manufacturers had to be safe. There's standards. They're enforced. Done. And then the other one is things like software quality, which was customer demand. Hey, I'm buying stuff from you. I expect it to work. And the problem with security is it's simultaneously very distributed and not regulated really at all, frankly. And consumers haven't really woken up to that. It's getting more that direction. SBOMs and the legislation around that has certainly driven some companies to at least demand, if they're going to buy a piece of software from somebody, that they give them a bill of materials. But the next step will be, tell me what the vulnerabilities are. That's coming soon. But fundamentally, we just still haven't gotten to the point where the average person consuming software, the average business consuming software, is even asking the right questions, never mind putting commercial demand on their suppliers.
Do we think regulation will, look at PCI DSS is probably the best example of regulated industry. They've got a lot to lose if they don't get their AppSec right. What do you think that'll happen more across other industries or government enforced?
I spent some time in critical devices like communications, and I will tell you, I think that sometime in the next 5 to 10 years, we're going to see the equivalent of an FDA for at least critical infrastructure and those kinds of things.
Operational technology, yeah.
Yeah, it's too important to everything. I use the food as an analogy. Software is as important to modern life as food is.
Yeah.
Yeah, I would agree. I think it's coming as well. And I'm not sure if you were making the point about comms, Jeffrey, or critical infrastructure, as in, electricity, oil, gas.
Yes, both.
The latter. Yeah, I mean, both. Yeah. I mean, I agree that for, what we're seeing in Ukraine and the capabilities of that Russia has, and, if we're frank or honest with ourselves, all of the major powers in the world have these capabilities, and they all need to defend themselves. So I think, there'll either be a global standard or, various countries will put standards in place. And once they're there for IoT, it's a pretty short leap to, everyday software or communication software, I would say, would be the next place. The things that we're using to communicate with each other on our phones.
Cars.
Those apps.
We know what they
cars,
are.
I'd even put that in the IoT category.
Yeah.
But then it's a relatively short leap to software itself. So I do think it's coming, and I think this consumer sentiment is changing as well. So I think the forces are aligned to, to make things like Microsoft's decision in 2003, and if we think about it, 2019 as well, where they developed a new cloud security business unit, which just this last quarter essentially saved Azure from falling into the black, or the red rather. Kept them in the black.
Made a lot of money.
Yeah, made a lot of money. Exactly. That's another way of saying that.
Yeah.
So we've got a little under 10 minutes left. We've got an attendee who wants to ask this question. They have a secure coding training program in place, but they can't get R&D teams to use the training. The training company wants them to do gaming, I'm assuming gamification. But the feedback I got from R&D leadership is that developers who win the game are not doing real development work. So I'm going to assume that means, well, I'm not going to assume.
I'll take a stab.
Okay,
I know
take a stab.
Because with our platform, we're gamified, so you do labs and you get points, and it was an interesting development where I think one of our financial services customers that won't be named just said, can you make it less gamey, because the CEO walks through and things people are kind of not doing training, they're just kind of playing around. So other than the CEO getting involved, I think it depends, right? If they are enjoying it because it's gamified and they're learning how to stop vulnerabilities or identify vulnerabilities, then what's the problem? It's the outcome is what we go on about. Are you getting the outcomes you need? If the outcome is you are getting more secure code, and that is the key really, is how do you prove it? Like how you do get the outcome, and that's what we bang on about a lot, is how do you prove that the coders are actually getting better, not just having a good game or whatever, but also just making sure that they do. And that's the thing about gamification. If you are getting the R&D teams to do it, then that's great. But yeah, I think there's sometimes people, depending on what org it is, get a bit funny about, oh, well, is it a game or is it gamification? And
This
really
education looks too fun. Make it less fun.
Yeah. I just need to click through. I wanted to do 100 multiple choice questions to prove I'm a good coder. Is not what we want, right?
No.
So yeah.
No, I mean, it looks to me like a lack of alignment just between middle management and whoever approved the training program. I mean, if the training program is approved, and it's hard to argue that gamification doesn't work, right? I mean, making education fun, I think is a pretty universally accepted principle. We don't want it to be boring, but in this case, if the R&D leadership is not on board with whomever made the decision to buy the program, then they're not going to be happy if someone wins the game, because they clearly don't think the game is important. So
they're not complaining that it's a game that's too gamified. What they're saying is security training isn't worth our time.
Exactly.
And that's a bad thing to hear. So I mean, one, if your job is secure code training or secure code advocacy, and you're hearing that from R&D, look somewhere. But second thing is, look, people take training that helps them. And if you aren't getting R&D to actually use the training, it's because the R&D people think it will not help them. Either because, most likely, secure coding isn't valued, or because, somebody somewhere is playing political games. But fundamentally, the trick here is they should be asking for training. They should have the right incentives in place that they need to write more secure code. And then they're asking, please give us the training to be able to do this better. But man, that is like the most dispiriting thing I've heard in a bit. Just no, we don't need to do secure code training. No, we're fine.
Here's another interesting comment. I think there's a need to disseminate simplification as one of the pillars of consideration, with particular emphasis on rationalization of amount of code. So I thought there was such a move and awareness. Has that gotten blown away with the leap to cloud and the latest in tech? What about AI ML spewing out code and replacing devs? So it sounds to me, if I was going to paraphrase that, do we need to be focused on simplification as one of the pillars of AppSec, maybe, or just amount of code? And then how does AI, ML, and automation play in? And are they going to replace developers? I don't think so, but let's see what you think.
All right, too much silence. I got to fill it.
I know.
Look, I think there's two good questions in there, but one is just fundamentally, yeah, simpler things are more secure. If you have 500 platforms for 300 applications, you have too much complexity, and this is not going to be very easy to keep secure. But it's really just a cost-benefit thing. The economies of scale are real. If all of my applications, and if I have 1,000 of them, but they all run in the same main platform, that's a lot easier to keep secure than if each of them have their own platform. And if each of them are using 13 different services. And if I've got 7,000 libraries all serving the same function that could be replaced by one. Consolidation, reuse, and standards matter to security. Absolutely. It goes right back to what I was saying before, though. People don't get rid of stuff that's currently working. Nobody says, let's get rid of these 3 platforms because we have this new one over here, and we'll just spend a little bit of time and put everybody on that platform. They don't. They put it off in the corner and they let it sit. And I think that's really what we're advocating with, like, some of the stuff where we're talking about life cycle and, reducing the complexity. And then the other part is, I think devs, frankly, I love the little question about, is AL, ML spewing out code replacing devs? No, that's not going to replace devs. What will replace devs is having very easy to use reusable components. I am certainly far from a developer, but I can write an Android application in an hour without writing more than a line of code.
Yeah.
And yeah.
Yeah, and I think that goes into the, AI and ML might write some code, but the things like business logic flaws, it's a great example where the more complex it is, the more likely you're going to get them, and the more AI ML, they might make it so it works, right? But will they find all those business logic flaws? Very unlikely. So again, it comes down to the person, and totally agree. Simplification as much as possible.
I want to add one just potential comment on what both Max and Jeff were saying. I mean, it may or may not be controversial, but there is a world in which simplified code, or code that's simpler, is actually easier to hack, right? So, I mean, if you reduce your the number of apps, you're in some ways putting more eggs in one basket, so to speak. You're reducing the number of pathways, but you're widening that one pathway into your backend server, for example. So it becomes the risk, the ROI for the attacker becomes greater if you only have 2 paths into your backend server. They can sort of spend all of their time on one of those 2 paths. So I mean, it's a little bit of an interesting conundrum, at least in my mind. It's like, do we all, in all cases, do we want to be simpler? Because if that one simple version of code is insecure, you don't want that to be the one that you're putting out into the world.
Well, on that note, we're almost at time, so I got to hand it back over to Cody to do the wrap up. But thank you all so much for being here today with me. This was super fun. Cody, it's all you.
Awesome. Thank you, Sharon, for keeping this train on the tracks today. And to Frank, Jeff, Max, and Dan, thank you all so much for joining us today. I really appreciate your inputs.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Thank you.
Thanks all.
It's always fun.
To our audience, I'd like to remind everyone that this session was recorded. So following this program, you'll receive an email with a link to access this recording on demand, or you can find it living on the Security Boulevard website at securityboulevard.com/webinars. So we do still have a couple of gift cards to give away. So the winners of our 4 $25 Amazon gift cards are Oksana R, Salman N, Jeff A, and Saeed S. So to our 4 winners, congratulations. Keep an eye on your inbox to claim those gift cards, but if you do not happen to see that email, please do check your spam folder. So to everyone joining us today, thank you so much for spending the last hour with us. As soon as we close out, you should see a survey that will pop up on your screen. So we really appreciate your time, but we also really appreciate your feedback. So please do let us know what you thought about today's program, what you'd like to see on future programs, what we did right, or maybe what we did wrong. Otherwise, we do hope to see everyone at an upcoming Techstrong Learning program. Have a great rest of your day. And Frank, Dan, Max, Jeff, Sharon, thank you all once again.
Cheers.
Thanks.
Thanks all.